Spirit, let me just begin with a few comments. I mean, the crucial story would be the Zhongji story, the Taoist philosopher Zhongji, who tells, of course, this funny story about whether we are able to understand or know other minds. Right, and the take that Cheng gives us on this one, and what that called to mind in terms of my own reading and background would be, the way in which this story ends up starts by being very complicated and sophisticated, and ends up by saying, well, we have to go back to the beginning. Now, it calls to mind, for me, two key texts. One would be this great poem by Yeats, I think it's called Among School Children, which ends up with this line about, we make these ladders which take us somewhere or other, and ladders here might be another word for theory. But the poem ends, you remember, with this line, right? We have to go back to where the ladders start, to the rag and bone shop of the heart, right? I mean, this is Yeats, but of course there's also a Wittgensteinian reference. I mean, if from the Tractatus to the philosophical investigations, one of his own self-critique of the Tractatus was that the theory of language there was too smooth, too crystal-like. And when that happens, thought has no purchase on things. So what Wittgenstein was saying was let us go back to the rough ground, right? Back to the rough ground. And I think that too would resonate with this notion of theory in the Zhongji story. Now, a second quick point I want to make would be this. If we try to summarize what the story is saying, or what Cheng is saying, I think a simplification would be to think that what he's arguing for is this notion that we murder to dissect. Right? That when we analyze something too quickly, we kill the object. Now, I think that is a little bit reductive, and I think the way in which Cheng gets around it is actually through the style of presentation, through this very important element that you find both in Zhongji and in what he says, which is this element of humor. Right? I mean, what the humor and the comedy does is to, as it were, displace the issues, right? Take us from from one position to somewhere else through comedy. I think, as Benjamin says, palpitations of the diaphragm, like laughter, are more important than palpitations of the spirit. Right? It's laughter is something even more important than all these high arguments. Now, another point that I think Cheng focused on, which I think is also interesting, is when he says that theory has its charm in itself, right? But that theory can, of course, also be a real killjoy, right? That it can really kill off, for example, what he would call a happy state of mind, right? Which is how the Zhangji story begins, and this leads to, I think, an interesting point where he says that for him, the important thing is not to explain one's feelings, but what he calls to feel one's feelings. Now, I mean, one way I think of translating that is to not read it as simply an argument that valorizes feelings, but to see it in relationship to, for example, a process like what we might call fascination. right? Like being fascinated by something. Now, what does it mean when we're fascinated by something? Fascination is neither knowledge nor ignorance. Now, in a certain Marxist context, fascination is always a form of mystification. Right? Like, for example, Susan Sontag wrote this famous essay called Fascinating Fascism, right? Where fascism uses fascination in order to mystify. So fascination becomes as a mode of mystification. But another way of thinking about fascination, which I think for me is closer to where Cheng is going, is to see fascination as having to do with neither knowledge nor ignorance, but having to do with a certain relationship to what we don't know. Right? And this relationship to what you don't know is something that is mediated by what you might call affect, right? By feeling, as it were, feeling your feelings and not just trying to theorize or explain it. And this, I think, is something that's potentially very interesting for thinking about artworks as well as about design. Now then, I think in the second part of his talk, he started off by talking about, for example, the conditions of the production of art. Like he was saying how in early art, what you find is art without names. And one of the most powerful examples of art without names would be, for example, these Buddhist sculptures. You know, these images, these figures of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas, which have an extremely powerful effect, even though they're not signed by any artist. But then, of course, later on, when the artist's name is added, according to Cheng, the power of art diminishes because then art becomes linked to a certain extent to a kind of personality cult, right? And maybe you see certain parallels here with design, how you have design on the one hand, and then of course designers and brand name designers on the other hand, right? So you might have a designer, a brand designer, who can give us the most patent kind of rubbish, and it would still be accepted because of the cult of personality. And of course, what this leads to, I think then he went on from here to something about to some notion of the cult of the artist. How and I think this is something that I also believe very much in. That one of the things I always say is that artists are as stupid as you or me. Right? I don't think there's any need to exalt the artist or to think about art as a superhuman activity. That the artist, by the mere fact that he or she is doing art, has a kind of superhuman status. And I think Cheng is saying that to think about artists as Superman is bad both for artists and for people who respond to art. And of course, he answered by saying that he's not Superman. That what then we would then have to sort of move towards maybe would be a different notion or different issues about what art creation design might be, which could be a notion, for example, of the ordinary, the flat, the everyday, and how these things, the ordinary, the flat, the everyday, are in fact objects that escape attention, but which are also entirely worthy of attention. Now, I think one final point I want to comment on is what he puts down as the relationship between art and alienation. And I think one context here is a story that I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with, which is a story by Borges called Borges and I. Right? You remember that story where Borges writes, there are these two Borges. One is Borges, me, and the other one is this public Borges, Borges the writer, who writes this. He's invited to conferences or seminars. He has all these literary honors and so on and so forth. But he said, Borges says in the text, well, I don't feel that close to this public Borges. So I mean, that's one sense of alienation. But the text, as you remember, ends with this punchline. Right? Because he writes all this, and then you have one sense of what alienation might be, but the story ends on this question, or on this statement: I don't know who wrote this text. I mean, is this the public Borges, or this Borges, or the existential Borges? And at what point do these distinctions blur? Now, so I think here the question of alienation, as Cheng puts it. Now, this question of, for example, who am I, right? Am I an alienated individual? Now, as he says, the very fact that I ask a question like that, right? The very fact that someone should ask a question like, am I alienated? Have I lost my identity? The very fact that you're asking a question like that, in fact, shows that you are already alienated. Right? So maybe one of the conclusions here would then to be something like this, that to a certain extent, a certain kind of alienation is inevitable. I mean, we're all alienated individuals. So now if this is so, and I think this is so, then the question then would be, what are you going to make of this inevitability of alienation? How are you going to turn it to productive and useful purposes? How can you be in touch? I think that's what he said, with things. How can you, as it were, change your identity? And one of the ways, I suppose, which is, it seems to me, Cheng is also moving towards, would be maybe to practice a kind of, how shall we put it, to practice a kind of controlled schizophrenia. Right? I mean, to be alienated, schizophrenic, but then it would be a certain kind of controlled schizophrenia, and maybe by doing that, we arrive at the only kind of artistic freedom that we can find. And of course, there are many examples of this tech, right, in contemporary art. I mean, some more spectacular than others. And of course, I suppose that the most spectacular example would be the Portuguese writer Pessoa, right, who of course has a series of heteronyms, who actually practices what we are calling controlled schizophrenia, and whose work, of course, are sort of real classics of the contemporary. That any attempt to think the contemporary would have to think also in terms of figures like Pessoa and also people like Cheng and this sort of notion of freedom and alienation, and how freedom and alienation has to go through, right, these mediations of what I'm calling the schizophrenic. We can ask, if he likes, we can ask Cheng to respond briefly to this, if he feels like it. I mean, if he thinks a certain dialogue can continue a little bit, and then we can open it up to discussion. We have until like 10:30, so there'll be time for people to ask questions, and then we'll break out sessions, and then we come back for the general discussion.
我觉得阿克尔给了我不少启发，因为我其实是个剥削者，就是很注意从别人那边得到东西。当然，如果大家想从我这儿拿到东西，我也不吝啬。刚才说到就因为我很长时间处在这个关于自己的自由状态和被异化 这件事，这个矛盾当中呢，刚才阿克巴说一个精神分裂的这个，那这个提醒我，其实这是很重要的一个创作现象或者创作方法，我觉得都可以这么说。比如一个演员，我们作为观众来说，那看这一次，我们会觉得会哭啊，会笑啊，会等等。但是作为一个演员，他要连续演1个月，他怎么能够保持下去？他要保持每一次又是真的，同时在体力在控制什么，他要每天晚上这么做1个月，或者说拍电影，因为他是我们知道他经常一段他要重拍 NG 不断的这么，那一个演员怎么会能够经受得住这种折磨？所以一个经验不够丰富的演员常常说我哭不出来了，因为刚才我把真的已经都给出去了，但是导演说可能这次其他方面有一点差错，我们需要再来一遍，但是我来不了。那一个好的演员其实就是双重人格，有一重人格是自己的人格，有一重人格是角色的人格。自己的这个人格就是在表演过程当中呢，是自己这重人格在监视自己那个角色人格。是不是说太长了？
没事，说不出来我就瞎编吧。What Akbar just said really gave me a lot of inspirations, because I'm personally a exploiter. I'm constantly getting something out of other people. But of course, if I have something I can offer, of course, it's no problem. And what he said was really what I have. I really agree is we are constantly working with this conflict between freedom and the alienation, and the controlled schizophrenia, like he mentioned, is really a way of a process or methodology in creation, in art creation. One example I can think of is the acting. For example, a stage actor, we go there, we go see a play, we cry, and we get a story, but the actor has to keep doing it for a month. And how does he manage to physically and emotionally and keep it real and keep that good state of creation? A similar story is a similar example is in the film. You always, sometimes you offered your best, but the director says it's no good. You have to start over for some reason. And inexperienced actors would not be able to stand this kind of torture. Tell the director, I've run out of tears. I cannot do it anymore. So we're always looking at this double persona, like two personalities. One is the personality of your own, and the other one is the personality of the role. And the personality of your own is always overlooking and looking at this the personality of the role you're playing.
写作也是这样一个过程，就是好像有一个写作的人格，还有一个你自己的人格，你在监视那个写作人格。这个情况常常出现在我自己的写作经验当中。写作不可能是从现在开始当中没有吃饭，没有上厕所，没有睡觉，一直到把它写完。那么怎么做一个阶段， 怎么做一个阶段，其实是自己知道，自己看自己的那个写作人格，好，保持这个状态，记住这个状态。到第二天再开始写的时候，是你自己看自己恢复到昨天那个状态没有？如果恢复到昨天那个状态，你无论怎么写都是衔接的。如果没有恢复到那个状态，或者变成另外一个状态，它是不衔接的。这个在我阅读别人的作品的时候，我会很明显的看出，他在这一段他可能是睡觉去了，因为后面那个是不太接。
The act of writing takes on a similar process in which your own persona is kind of overlooking the writer persona. So in this writing, it's not possible that you don't go have dinner or go to the bathroom or go to sleep or anything. But how do we maintain this state of being? And in this process, this is when I have to make myself remember this state of being, so that on the second day, when I come back, I can see myself resuming to the state I was yesterday, so that there is some linkage between what I'm writing today and what I did yesterday. If not, there will be no linkage. And this is very obvious when I'm reading other people's writing. I can, at a certain paragraph, I can realize, oh, this person must have gone to dinner or went to sleep. There's sometimes clearly no clear linkage.
所以，我想阿格尔说的这个精神分裂大概是好方法。
So the word schizophrenia, according to Akbar, may be a compliment, a good word.
Let me just make two quick comments. One is Cheng doesn't forget about shit, so shit comes into the argument, which is very important. And the second quick point would be, when he talks about acting, this is the problem of method acting. I mean, the reason why method acting is so boring is that it's this premise of what is my motivation. Right? That the way in which you have to identify with the character and constantly ask, what is my motivation? So you become, as it were, the psychological incarnation of a certain person. But that, I suppose, would be the exact opposite of schizophrenia in the way in which we're trying to talk about. Okay, maybe we have like a few minutes for some quick comments or questions. So let's open this to the floor. Yes, please.
Hi, Akbar. So let me just call you on one of the pieces of schizophrenic performance that you just did in framing today's session. So you began by saying these are four of the most amazing Chinese artists out of one side of your schizophrenic brain. At the other side, you said, but he is not a Superman. And obviously, the whole day has been set up to be very reverent about these four artists. So can you talk a little bit about the ethics of schizophrenia for the people who have to witness the schizophrenia? Because if you've been in the presence of someone who is schizophrenic, you don't valorize it in the way that this conversation has valorized it. It's very confusing, and it ends up doing very damage to the people who have to be in the presence of that.
That's right. Well, I suppose maybe since we are into Taoism and Zhongji and so on and so forth, another quotation would be something like this: when you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. I mean, you remember that idea, right? You meet the Buddha, kill. So in terms of reverence, the most irreverent thing to do is to show reverence. And the most reverent thing to do is to show irreverence in terms of the way I think we deal with art and artworks. Now, this is not tantamount to disrespect or to trying to sort of, it's not even iconoclasm. This is how it has to work, right? So is there a contradiction between introducing today's session as, four of the most important artists in China? I mean, they are four of the most important artists in China. I mean, I would stick to that. Should we, as it were, bow at their feet and crawl in front of them? Certainly not. I mean, the whole point here is that, I mean, there's a discourse. As I say, artists are as stupid as you and me, or the opposite. So it's like always a question of taking what is said, translating, appropriating it, and taking it elsewhere. I mean, it's a process which might not be irrelevant to the way we might think about design as well, right? So I mean, the worst thing, of course, is to come up with a kind of a kind of design and name, with a brand name, and as it were, simply sort of bow before it, right? So. Are there contradictions here? There might be, but as Walt Whitman say, do I contradict myself? Yes, I contradict myself. Right? I'm large. I contain multitudes, or schizophrenic moments. Simon?
I want to ask Cheng something. I was very taken by your story the first day that you presented. And I'm very interested in the figure of the dragon. You talked about the dragon as a form of instrument, as a tool, as a vehicle. And I am also impressed with how the dragon is, in a sense, also an animal. So I want to know, I mean, in my way of thinking, there is a linkage between what we think of as animals and the drives. Drives being such as the drive towards violence, the drive towards eating, appetite, sexuality, etc. But what I was very impressed with your distinction between the dragon as instrument or vehicle and the dragon as a subject matter or essence. Is that in a way we can think about language as a vehicle, or material that an artist would make. In other words, to think about the dragon as a type of medium. I wonder if you have some comments on that.
Sorry, can you repeat the last sentence? I didn't quite.
Can you, maybe if you have some thoughts on the idea of the dragon as a medium, rather than a goal.
我还记得那天说到的是，工具和主体的一个关系，因为这个话题，工具和主体，也是我长久会想到的这样的一个关系。如果举最好的例子的话，今天可能时间不够，就是中国文字 中国文字自己的现在的争论，在中国开始这个关于简体字和繁体字的这个争论非常高涨。那么最重要的一个分歧点就是中国的字是不是仅仅是一个工具？如果只是一个工具的话，那简化字没有错误，因为笔划越小越少越方便。但是中国字真的不仅仅是一个工具。
As you said, I think the subject of vehicle and the goal, the subject, is very interesting in terms of the relationship. I have a good example, but I would be running out of time if I get into this. But I could give an example of the Chinese characters, because currently there's a lot of debate over whether we stick with the simplified Chinese characters or go back to the classic, which is more complicated. And the main point of divergence would be, is the Chinese character merely a tool, or is it more than that? Because if we just use it as a tool, it's perfectly okay to go with the simplified, because it's easier, it's perfectly okay. But the Chinese character, it's so much more than that.
我说中国字不仅仅是一个工具，它其实已经有了自己的主体性的一个例子，就是中国会出现书法艺术。如果它没有自己的一个主体性的时候，它就不会产生一个书法艺术。
The reason why I'm saying Chinese character is more than a tool is it has the value of its own, because otherwise there wouldn't be the Chinese art of calligraphy.
但是很可能是我没有掌握你的问题，大概是。
I hope I got your question and I answered your question.
Well, if there are no more, okay, one last question, okay, and then we can always come back after the break to, yes.
I have a question for Cheng, so I'm going to ask in Chinese. 您刚才说到那个很多理论跟创作的关系嘛，然后您说您觉得理论有理论的魅力，我想再听您说说看，您觉得这个魅力具体是在哪个地方？然后还有一个问题就是，您刚才讲都是理论跟创作，我就想问，如果从一个读者或观众的角度，您觉得这个理论在这个大家欣赏这些作品的时候，应该扮演一个什么作用？So the two questions are, because Cheng just talked about the charms of theory, so I just want to ask him, where exactly is this attraction and the charm of theory? And the second question is, okay. So from a spectator's perspective or audience perspective, what does he think about, like, what role should theory play in the perception or reception of art? Thank you.
He probably means the discrete charm of theory.
我是属于这个饭店里面那个应该是waiter 的那种记忆，就是排除性记忆。你如果问第二个问题，我就会把第一个问题忘掉。
My type of memory is like a hotel waiter. If you ask a second question, the first question would automatically disappear out of my mind.
对，你不能跟中国的一个这个就是服务员说我要一个啤酒，我还要一双筷子。那他一定给你拿一个筷子，没有拿那个啤酒。
You can't say to a Chinese waiter, say, "Hey, I want a bottle of beer and a pair of chopsticks." You have to make two trips and make two requests.
所以刚才说是一个问题，你能不能选择一个，我来回答
？Can we go with one question?
其实您答哪个都行，啤酒和筷子都可以。 到一个
他已经全忘了，从来
不
忘。
不不，不，他说了，我想起来，第一个是不是理论的魅力是吧？嗯。
Now I remember the charm of theory.
就是思辨是一种能力。我经过训练，我能跳高，跳过我的这个身高。你跳过去的时候，你会被自己这个感动，或者被自己的这个能力呢，哎，这个非常喜欢自己有这个能力。我觉得思辨这种能力跟这个有点像，就是当你思辨能够达到一种细致或者涵盖，或者能够解释一部分问题，解释所有的问题的时候，这个能力是我觉得是有魅力的，是这个能力的魅力，而不是他真的去就是建立了一个什么。有的时候常常这个理论就是当它完整的时候，它就死掉了。它常常在它不完整的时候，那个时候的能力是那个魅力是最大。所以我就说，中国常常说的马克思，当他的理论完成的时候，马克思就将这个理论就已经死掉了。
Go back to the question of the charm of theory. I think thinking is a skill. Once you build that capacity, like when you're being able to jump over a high fence, you become very fascinated and charmed by that ability. And when you're able to make very refined, comprehensive, good explanation of part or all of this issue, I think it's a very fascinating process. Sometimes when a theory becomes complete, it becomes dead at the same time. And when it's still in the process of incompleteness, then that's when it is charming. Like the theory of Karl Marx, once it got complete and it became stiff, it became dead.
Okay, maybe this is a good time to take a break.